Well, this morning, if you have a Bible, you can look in 2 Samuel. So we've been reading through the Bible together so far this year. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is where we're going to plant ourselves here in just a few minutes. As I was thinking about and reading through this week, I was reminded of one of my favorite comedians. It's Brian Regan. Mostly clean comedy, one of the few that you can say that about these days. But he has this routine where he talks about how he says, I hear that reading is good for you. And so he says, I've been trying to read some. And he goes on, he talks about, he says, if reading is really so good for you, why do they have to put the title at the top of every single page? He says, has anybody ever been reading a book and you get halfway through, it's like, what was I reading again? You have to go back to the front and say, oh, that's what it was. So instead of having to do that, we're going to put the title at the top of every single page. Why do they do that? I really don't know. But I was thinking about that because as we've been reading through the Bible, this long book written over a period of time of at least 1,500 years, covering events that have taken at least 4,500 years or more to enact. And while we've been reading these real accounts of real events, some of which are bizarre, some are really gruesome, and all of them seem to come either from a soap opera or some Quentin Tarantino movie. Am I right? Have you noticed that? It's like all of it is just crazy stuff. But if you hadn't noticed, there have been consistent but sporadic, if you could say those at the same time, and intentional reminders of what the big story is all about. We saw it in Genesis chapter 3, when the man and the woman who had been created to live in this perfect place blew it. They chose to do what they wanted to do in disobedience of God. But as part of the consequences of their sin, God made a promise that Eve would have a descendant. Not Adam, but Eve would have a descendant who would crush the head of the serpent who had enticed them. In other words, win ultimate victory over evil and the one who initiated evil, and bring life to people throughout the world. And so we see that as a very first indication that God is planning on sending someone who's going to be the answer to all the problems that Adam and Eve's sin have created. Anybody remember some of the other sightings we've seen of this promised one, this one that we will call and see called more and more the Messiah? Where have we seen some pictures of, or whether symbolic or actual spoken references to him as we've been reading so far in the Old Testament? Abraham. He made a promise to Abraham, didn't he? What did he tell Abraham that was a promise about that?
Through your seed, all the nations will be blessed.
He said to Abraham, who was 75 and childless at the time, by the way, that you're going to be the father of a great nation, and through your seed, singular, one of your descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Same guy. Any other pictures that you can think of that we've seen that gave us were foreshadowing or a reminder, like a title at the top of the page of the book of what the big story is about? The snake on the pole. As a consequence of their sin, the Israelites had a swarm of snakes come in, and they were biting them, and a lot of people were dying. And God told Moses, here's what I want you to do. Make a snake out of bronze, attach it to a pole, hold it up. Everybody who looks at the snake up on the pole, they will be cured. Yeah, that was another good one. What about, as we are looking forward to in the next couple of weeks, Easter Sunday, but for our Jewish friends, the Passover? Any pictures in the Passover that were a reminder or foreshadowing for us? Come on. Huh?
The blood on the door.
The blood on the door that came from where?
A lamb.
They came from a lamb that had to die, blood over the door to mark the houses of those who were trusting in what God said to do to save their lives, and Angel of death passed over those houses and spared the life of the firstborn sons. So we see these things happening over and over again. In Deuteronomy 18, Moses spoke of another prophet like himself who would come and who would speak the words of the Lord. So we keep seeing these bits and pieces of the big story, these indications of what's coming on, this foreshadowing. We see it, for instance, in a subtle reference in 1 Samuel chapter 2 that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, when this childless woman by the name of Hannah has prayed and asked the Lord to give her a child. And he answers her prayer, and now she brings her son after he has been weaned. She brings him to the tent of meeting, the place where all Israel would come to worship, where the Ark of the Covenant with the Ten Commandments in it was kept, and the presence of God dwelled there. And she brings his son to dedicate him to God. He's going to grow up in this place with the priests. And she dedicates him to the Lord, and she has this wonderful prayer of praise and thanksgiving to the Lord. But in it, she says this, in 1 Samuel 2:10, look, the words are on the screen here. It says, "The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven." That is, the Lord will thunder in heaven. "The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed." Now that's an interesting thing, because at the time, did Israel have a king? No, they'd been ruled by judges for hundreds of years at this point, right? And yet she's saying that the Lord will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed one. Anybody know another word that we may use, maybe familiar to us, who have been around church for a while, read the Bible for a while, for anointed one? A word that we use. There's one Hebrew word and there's one Greek word that we see in the Bible over and over again that is a translation of what we see here as anointed one. Go ahead. Messiah is one. That's the Hebrew one. And what's another one in the New Testament? Christ. Messiah and Christ. They both mean anointed one. She's talking here about a Messiah to come, about a Christ to come. And this is a lady that she's, the only thing we know about her is she had great faith in God to give her a son that she would dedicate to the Lord. And now she's praying and prophesying about a Messiah, an anointed one who will come later, who will be given strength and power as a king that is above all others. I mean, this was happening in a time, it was like just the worst of times. We see 4 times in the book of Judges, everybody did what was right in his own eyes. The priests were so corrupt, they made the Roman Catholic priests of our day, makes their scandal seem minor. And yes, the pun was intended. They just abused the worship practices. They abused the young women who were there to help serve the Lord and in and around the tent of meeting. It was just awful times, and yet God gives Hannah this special child and a prophecy of a king and a Messiah who would rule over all the world with superior strength to everyone else. So then we get into 2 Samuel. This is what we were reading this past week. And in 2 Samuel, chapter 7, we see God making a covenant with King David about his rule and his reign and his family. And I want us to read verses 12 through 16. So follow along with me as we go through this together, okay? God is speaking here, and he says, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the Son of Men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established," how long? Forever. So what's God promising here to David? What's the promise that he makes?
There will be a kingdom that shares his lineage.
Yes. How long, everybody? Forever, right? God is telling David basically that his descendants, one of his descendants or his descendants, will be ruling forever. Okay? That's pretty amazing promise, but here's the problem. How long did David reign? Anybody remember from your reading how long he was king?
37 years?
Close. He says he was 7.5 years the king over Judah, his home tribe. And then for the remainder, another 32.5 years, he was king of all Israel. So 40 years basically, give or take a few months. David was king over Israel. And then shortly after that, he died. Who followed David as king? Solomon, his son Solomon. Interestingly enough, as we read this past week, who was a child of a woman with whom David committed adultery. And how long did Solomon reign? Anybody know? It's a very familiar number.
40 years.
40 years. Yes. Solomon reigns for 40 years after David had reigned 40 years. No, wait, didn't God tell him that he was going after him, he would raise up a son who would reign forever? Solomon did reign forever. And we see generation after generation of David's sons. None of them lived forever. So why did David's descendants not continue to live forever? I mean, we're gonna see in just a minute a video that reminds us there came a time when none of them were king over Israel. What was it that kept getting in the way of David's descendants living and reigning forever? No one of them could live and reign forever. What was the problem?
Sin.
It was a simple question, wasn't it? Sin. None of them were perfect. And because of that, none of them could reign forever. I wonder, could it be that God's promise to David that one of his descendants would reign as king forever meant more than just a political position? That it was connected to this idea we've seen at the top of the pages over and over again through the Old Testament. This idea of a Messiah who had been promised in Genesis chapter 3. I want you to look at this video that we're going to watch from the Bible Project that goes along with the reading. You may have seen already, but let's watch it again because I think it gives such a great picture here.
There's this crazy story at the beginning of the Bible. We have Adam and Eve, and they're in the Garden of Eden.
And everything in this garden is great. It's exactly as it should be. Except there's this one tree that they're told by God not to eat from because it's dangerous and it will kill them.
So that's it. Avoid this fruit tree and we're fine.
Right? It seems pretty simple. But in this garden, there's a snake. And it starts telling a different story. It says that if you eat of this tree, it's not going to kill you. In fact, it's going to make you become like God.
And Adam and Eve, they believe the snake and they eat the fruit.
And because of this, the goodness of the garden is tragically lost and evil and death enters into God's good world.
Now, why is there a talking snake in the garden? I mean, this thing is a problem.
Yeah, it's very strange. And even more strange is the fact that the Bible doesn't say why or how this thing even got there. It just presents the snake as this creature who's in rebellion against God and that wants to get other people to doubt God's goodness and lead them on a path towards death. And so whatever this snake is, it's the source of evil that pervades our world and our lives, even still today.
But there is some hope because right here in the story, God makes this really interesting promise to Adam and Eve.
That someone is going to come in the future, a son of Eve. And this guy's going to come and he's going to crush the serpent's head and destroy evil at its source. However, during this battle, the serpent is going to bite this guy's heel.
So it's like a mutual destruction.
Yeah, it's this very strange but beautiful promise. And it's just like hanging there until the next key moment in the story. When God singles out this guy named Abraham and says that through his family, goodness and blessing is going to be restored back to all of the nations of the world. And as we follow this family, we get to one of Abraham's great-grandsons, this guy named Judah. And he receives this promise that a king is going to come from his line and that the whole world's going to follow this king and he's going to bring peace and harmony and there'll be lots of food and wine and milk and vineyards and it's going to be awesome.
The first king that we meet from the line of Judah is a guy named King David. And he's a hero. Maybe he is the snake crusher.
But it turns out that David is infected with the same evil as the rest of humanity. He never crushes the snake, just the opposite. However, God makes a promise to David that this king is going to eventually come from his line. But as you go on in the story, one by one, each generation of his sons, they're just total chumps. They give into the snake, they choose evil, they go after money and sex and power and following other gods.
Things get so bad that they run the nation of Israel right into the ground, and the big bad empire of Babylon just takes them out.
And so now there are no more kings to even fulfill this promise.
So it seems like the whole plan is lost.
But during these dark days, there's this crazy group of guys called prophets, and they just kept talking about this coming king and reminding us of the promise that he'll come, he'll defeat evil, he'll restore the garden. Now, one specific prophet, Isaiah, he tells us more about why this king is bitten. Isaiah says that the promised king receives this wound because of humanity's evil, and then it kills him. But then all of a sudden he comes back, and Isaiah says that because he suffered this wound, that he can now become a source of healing to other people.
But the Old Testament ends, and the snake-crushing king that everyone's been talking about never shows up.
And this is why, when the New Testament begins, it introduces us to Jesus of Nazareth, not as some random guy, but as someone who comes to fulfill these specific ancient promises.
Yeah, we learn that he's from the line of David, Judah, and Abraham.
And he goes around Israel announcing that the goodness of God's kingdom is here, now. And he begins confronting the effects of evil on people by healing them, by forgiving them of their sins and evil.
Many people are now believing that this is, in fact, the promised king.
But Jesus began telling his closest followers that he was going to become king and bring peace by taking the full effect of humanity's evil into himself.
The fatal snake bite wound.
Exactly. And so it seems like the serpent wins. And this story actually would be a tragedy except for what happens next. Jesus rises from the dead.
And now Jesus has the power over evil and death for himself.
And so the rest of the New Testament is then making this claim that Jesus' power over evil and death has now become available to us to begin confronting the effects of evil in our lives.
But even still, death and evil are a real problem in our world all around us.
And so the story of the Bible ends by describing this future day when Jesus comes back and he finishes the job. He destroys the snake once and for all, and he restores the goodness of the garden here on earth.
All right. So something for us to talk about here. How do we see our need for a Messiah in Israel's kings? Think about that for a moment. We've been talking about this morning from the very beginning. We just keep seeing this, as they call it, snake-crushing king. I love that title. Keeps popping up. Keep seeing references to him. Symbolic images that point to him. And yet, we have other men and women who come and on the scene. They serve as judges. We see people of faith like Hannah. Then we see these kings. The people of Israel said, we want a king. And God says, okay, I'll give you a king. There's going to be consequences, but I'll give you a king. So he gives them Saul, the tallest and the handsomest man in the land. I mean, he didn't even have to ask the mirror on the wall. Everybody knew he was the handsomest man in the world. I mean, in the land. So, hey, give him this great king. But as we saw last week, his insecurity and his idolatry in the form of a fear of others' opinions about him led him to rebel against God and lose everything, including the life of his sons and himself. Then comes David. David's called a man after God's own heart. He's a member of the tribe of Judah, which their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Jacob had prophesied that Judah would be the tribe from which the king would come. David was also very handsome. He was fearless. He was famous for slaying giants and tens of thousands of the enemy. He loved God. He wrote the most popular worship songs in the history of the world. And he wanted more than anything to build this amazing house for God to live in. But he didn't get to live as king forever. Where did he go wrong? What did we read about this week about some of the ways that David went wrong? Had an affair with Bathsheba. Had her husband killed. That's pretty gruesome stuff, right? For a man after God's own heart. What else? Do you see anything else, man?
Try to hide it all
He tried to hide it all. Yeah.
from the people.
The cover up. In our day, they say, oftentimes we hear people say the cover up's worse than the original sin. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true, but in terms of our media-driven world, it can get blown up to be pretty huge. Evidently, we see he had issues with his kids.
Yeah, his fears and inability to parent his kids well
Yeah.
led them to do some terrible, terrible things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, this week we're going to read about Solomon and another 300 plus years worth of David's descendants who serve as kings, some good, mostly bad. And when we look at them in light of God's promise to Eve and Abraham and to David himself and to others, what can we learn from the stories of these kings who were supposed to be a part of God's plan to reign forever over his people? What do we see in their examples that we can take and we can apply to our lives? What can we learn about this idea of the Messiah who would reign forever? Why didn't any of them last forever and reign forever as king?
They're all sinful.
Because they were all sinful, right? Mm-hmm. We see example after example of that. Do any of these guys fully meet the promise that God had given to Eve, Abraham, and everybody else up to that time? What was it that they were this person that was supposed to do, that was going to be able to fulfill the promises?
Crush the snake.
Got to crush the snake, all right. Got to win the ultimate victory over evil. What else was promised would happen through this person?
Come back and be able to take away the evil from other people.
Okay, come back, take away the evil from others. Yeah. How widespread would that be? Just for Israel? Just for Abraham's descendants?
Sure. No, I'm just kidding.
Who else, Ingrid? Yep.
Everybody.
For everybody. Remember the promise to Abraham? Your seed will be a blessing. All the nations will be blessed in him. All right. So what we're seeing here is that none of David's sons could fully meet the promises because none of them could live out that life of being one who could crush the serpent, be a snake crusher. And because they had all fallen victim to the snake themselves. They'd all fallen victim to the sin themselves. And none of them could be a blessing to everybody, even though some of them, like David and Solomon, had the ability to give blessing to others. Joseph, one of their forefathers, he was able to bless Egypt and the known world around him when there was a terrible famine. So there was occasional mixture of this, but nobody could be a blessing to all the people groups in the world. And that's why in the next 2 weeks, we're going to see this story, as Keen and I are going to be sharing with you this story about the one that fulfills all of the requirements, who fulfills the promise completely, and through everything he did to be the snake-crushing king through whom all nations could be blessed. So I want you to keep that in mind, because remember, if we keep seeing, like the title at the top of every page, we just keep seeing throughout history God reminding people, this one is coming, this snake crushing king is coming, this Messiah, this anointed one, this one through whom all the world is going to be blessed, keeps coming up. It's a part of everybody's story. Then is it a part of your story? Is it a part of our story today? So I would encourage you this week as you're reading to be thinking about everything you read in light of this story. The title at the top of the page. We need a Messiah. Where can we find a snake-crushing king? See it, put yourself in those times, in the lives of those kings and their people and the world in general at that time, and think about where can we find a Messiah. See how the need made itself evident and how the hope of that coming fulfiller of the promises was always out there in front of them. And for everyone who had faith, it encouraged them to be able to keep pressing on. I wonder, was there anything else that you saw as you were reading? Because we've read some really interesting stuff this last week or so. Did you see anything else this week that stood out to you or that spoke to you that you could share with us, that we could glean from it? Or maybe it was something you didn't quite understand and you were curious if anybody else might have gotten another take on it or a better take on it.
I thought it was interesting how the second son that was born from the relationship between Bathsheba and David turned out to be Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. So I thought it was cool, in spite of all the inherent evil of what David did, and there were still, God was able to bring something good out of it.
Yeah. What can we learn from that example, you think?
I think it's similar with Joseph, where man intended for evil, God can still intend for good.
Wow. How do you apply that to your life today? That God can take a heinous sin and somehow out of that bring a king, bring something amazing. As Braden mentioned, the wisest man who ever lived somehow came out of that. How does that speak to you in your life right now?
It gives me hope, because when life is hard, when painful stuff happens to us, and when people do painful things to us, or when we do painful things, it shows that God isn't beneath the failings of this world, but that He has a plan and an opportunity to redeem the things that I currently see as irredeemable.
Yeah. How anybody who looks, as we read back in 2 Samuel 11 and we read the story about how David, number one, was failing in his duties. He should have gone out to war with the armies, because that's what kings did in the spring of the year. And it mentions that very clearly. In the time when kings go out to war, David stayed home. He's being lazy. On the top of his roof, he's watching a woman take a bath, brings her to himself, commits adultery with her, finds out she's pregnant, brings her husband home to try to cover it up, and he won't go to her because he would feel unfaithful to his soldiers. So he's being faithful to and loyal to do what he's supposed to do. And when David can't convince him, can't get him drunk and even make him go home, he sends him back to the front with a secret note to the general to put the husband out there on the front lines and have everybody else draw back from him so that he will be killed by the enemy. I mean, it's at the very least conspiracy to murder. It's a horrible, horrible story for the anointed one of God, who was the king of God's people. And yet we see this horrible thing that he did And there were consequences of it because the first child that was conceived by Bathsheba with David did die. But the second one becomes Solomon. What do we call that when we do horrible things and God is still able to bring good out of it and bring blessing after there's repentance? What do we call that? Grace and redemption. Yeah, both of those words are perfect for this. It's grace. And that's a great encouragement for us. This grace of God, when we know that David's not that far beyond us, if any, in some of the things that we've thought and said and done in our lifetimes, right? Anything else?
One of the things that stuck out to me in our reading this past week, so there's two advisors that stuck with Absalom. One was like undercover for David, but the other one was, I cannot say his name.
Is that Ahithophel?
Ahithophel? Is that how you say it?
Close enough.
You know, Ahithophel it is.
Until somebody can tell me. We'll go
No,
stick with that one.
Ahithophel it is. No, it really just struck me again because there's like 7 suicides in the Bible, and he's one of them because he gives some advice, and Hushai goes and basically undermines the advice on David's behalf. And when he correctly basically he goes to kill himself because he realizes that this plot is going to fail, so he puts his house in order, is what the Bible says, and then he hung himself. And I just thought it was, it just really struck me. And this character, for some reason, was in my mind. I was like, here's this really wise person. Everyone considered him wise. But what the Bible says was really interesting. If you go back a little bit to 2 Samuel 16, verse 23. Now in those days, the advice of Ahithophel
You go.
gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That is how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. I thought it was really interesting that of all the things that said about him, yes, he was wise, yes, he was a sage, but his wisdom was as if it was very much like someone who inquired of God, but it wasn't someone who did. And I thought it was so interesting how those two characters were separated, and someone can have the appearance of wisdom, someone can look like they have their life together, but unless they have God, unless they're inquiring of God, unless they're going to God, it really comes to nothing. Which is so funny in Proverbs. I mean, the title of Proverbs at the top would be, true wisdom is fearing God and, seeing the world through his lens. I mean, but how often do we count upon this is a really cool proverb. I should put it on as a tattoo on my arm or on a little picture frame in my house. And it's that's not real wisdom. So I just thought it was interesting, this character. He had every appearance of wisdom, but he was lacking the most important part.
Well, his depth, I think ultimately his lack of wisdom is a consequence of taking the side of Absalom, because David, in chapter 2 Samuel 15, David realizes that Ahithophel is, he realizes he's a traitor. He realizes, and in a state of mourning, as he's walking up the Mount of Olives, which is significant as we're about to enter into Holy Week, he prays to God. So one of his soldiers tells him Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom, and David's prayer is, "O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." So that direct result, everything with him, is a consequence of him going against the Lord's anointed, and God responds to David's prayer by turning his counsel into foolishness.
Kind of a Judas Iscariot character.
Yeah.
To be honest, in a lot of ways.
Because obviously David depended on him, because it says David considered his wisdom to be as someone who inquired of God, and then he turns on him.
Yeah.
So very much Judas-like.
Yeah, I think that's a complementary to what Jonathan was saying. I think that ultimately reminds us that it's not about God's protecting his anointed and his choice to do that led to Ahithophel's downfall, which simultaneously the point of like Jonathan was saying, Proverbs is ultimately that fear of the Lord is wisdom. It's like wisdom isn't of itself an inherently good thing. It is how it leads us to view God and worship God.
Yeah.
That's where it has value.
Children, we just jumped into the deep end of the pool. You know, right? It's good stuff, man. It's good stuff. Because let's be honest, we all have looked to people who were wise, seemingly wise people, but at some point, and Ahithophel may have actually heard from God at some point. Maybe it was when David started. Well, I don't know. It had to be before that because he rebelled against David. But at some point, at least, he starts listening to somebody that ain't God. And that brings shame on himself that he has to go and take his own life rather than be shamed by the fact that his wisdom was rejected and he knows that it's all going to come to nothing, that it's all going to fail. Wow.
Yeah, but wisdom is very deceiving to say, because I think Jeremiah talks about us having broken cisterns, things that we place our water in of life, hoping that will sustain us. And Jesus is the spring that has renewing water that never ends. But out of all the broken cisterns, why I find wisdom so scary is, success is obvious to see in someone's life when they're pursuing that instead of God. It's like, the guy who just is constantly worried about his job, thinking about his job. He's at work 70 hours, and it's so easy to go, dude, you're praising success, not not God, and blah blah blah. And that's how a lot of cisterns I feel are like. But for some reason, the cistern of wisdom is one that we almost kind of give it a pass. So if someone pursues wisdom to all ends, it's like, it's trying to just constantly think about how to help others with some sage advice, and we almost look at that person like, wow, that's really great. But just like any of those other broken cisterns, pursuing that doesn't actually save you. Only one thing does, the wellspring of life. And I think that's the most deceptive thing of all, and I think what he may have fallen prey to. Obviously, I don't know that, the Bible doesn't tell us that, but that's, I think, the scariest part about wisdom. It can fool us into thinking that we're pursuing something better than these other cisterns when it's just as broken as the others.
What does the word philosopher mean? A lover of wisdom. Right? So the Greeks were lovers of wisdom for wisdom's sake. Solomon said, pursue wisdom so that you can know God better and live out the blessings. Because wisdom, true wisdom, there is blessings. The spiritual laws that we talked about a few weeks ago, that there's blessing for following those spiritual laws, and that is what is wise. But if we pursue wisdom for wisdom's sake, it becomes an idol just like everything else. And I've heard in the past that during the times of the American and subsequent French Revolution, that there's an interesting dichotomy in that there were some of our forefathers who were philosophers, and they pursued wisdom for wisdom's sake and from a rationalistic perspective, but there were others who pursued the wisdom that comes from God. But in France, it was all about philosophy. It's all about classic ancient Greek philosophy and the ideas of freedom for freedom's sake, without any idea that freedom was a gift that comes from the creator of all people. And the reason that we've had one government and one constitution, good and bad at times, and that France has had 40 or more, is because theirs was all based purely on a humanistic view of man and wisdom, where ours is rooted in a biblical view of wisdom, even though we don't always see it that way anymore, which is why maybe we're having some of the same issues that they have in Europe, okay? But it's a great point. Wisdom is, the Bible talks about there is a wisdom that doesn't come from God. There's a difference between the two. And it says that the wisdom of God is foolishness to those who do not believe. The Greeks pursue wisdom, but that wisdom is foolishness to God. God's foolishness is even greater than man's wisdom. So, yeah, we have to be careful and recognize it's all about pursuing God first. Anything else? Yes.
This might be too much for right now, but we were talking about the medium with Saul.
No, we were actually going to talk about that Wednesday night. Uh-huh.
Because that was weird.
Yeah.
What a song.
The Witch of Endor.
Where Saul
Oh,
went
yeah.
and inquired of a witch or medium, asking to have a meeting with Samuel.
She pulled Samuel up. What?
But was that actually Samuel?
Right?
Because
So many questions.
All right. Yeah, Keenan and I had this conversation last week because he was talking about how you said, what in the world? For those of you who may not have read, surely all of you read, but anyway, for those of you who may not have read or maybe you've forgotten, Saul is getting ready to have to go into battle against the Philistines again, and he asks God what to do, and God is silent because God's turned his back on Saul. So Saul says, well, I need to find out from Samuel, but Samuel's already dead. So he goes to a witch or a medium, even though he's already outlawed mediums and had them all cast out of the country. But he finds one, goes to her undercover, and asks her to bring up Samuel for him. And Samuel appears, at least as far as they can tell. There's one of two options. Either one, it was a demon masquerading as Samuel, or it was actually Samuel. One of the interesting things to me is even the medium was freaked out by the fact that this person appeared. She was not expecting it, which leads me to believe that maybe it actually was Samuel, because she was used to seeing a different kind of spirit when she would try to intercede with the dead. No, I'm not nailing my reputation on that one, but it seems like it actually was Samuel, because Samuel's like, why in the world would you bring me back? If God's not talking to you, there's a reason for that, because he's turned his back on you. But since I'm here, just know tomorrow you and your sons are going to die. But it is a very weird story. If you didn't read that one, you might want to go back and look at it again and see what you can get. Karen, did you have something else that you saw?
I just don't understand. How does she have the power to bring Samuel? Like,
Well,
if God's already not speaking to him.
Yeah.
I would argue that if we go with the latter option of David's too, and that it was actually Samuel, it was God interceding in that moment. It wasn't by her power. It was God choosing to use, a thing that's come up, something that's evil inherently, necromancy and all that stuff, to accomplish his will, to say, Saul, this is one more sign that you are not king. And through this experience, I will tell you one more time that this is the end for you.
Yeah. See, we want to say witches, mediums, we think about people on TV, mediums, whatever, so it's kind of like a joke kind of thing. It evidently was real stuff. They could communicate with who they thought was the dead, but what we see in other places is, hey, once you die, then you go to the judgment, after Jesus at least, but that there are demons who can come representing the dead. And that's probably what her business was built on, is she could bring up somebody, maybe she didn't even realize that what she was doing was communicating with demons, but to have been involved in that, there obviously was some turning away from the Lord God and seeking after powers other than from him. And the result was she would usually see these dark figures, demonic type figures maybe, and now suddenly here's somebody she doesn't recognize. And there's a different feel altogether because it's actually Samuel. Come back with a final declaration of warning and death to Saul. Not a practice we want to perpetuate, okay? I'm going to go to a medium and maybe I can get somebody from God to come speak to me because I really need an answer. No, don't do that. Yeah, that's right.
I do have a logistical question.
Yeah.
This is just one I've never just really figured out. So we hold to the story that Samuel was the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which was written as one book technically because the scroll was just that long.
Mm.
Samuel dies halfway through the scroll. So somehow he authored life after his death. Why do we still hold on to the fact that he's the author of the entire scroll of Samuel when he wasn't alive for some of the scroll.
Yeah, I think we gotta.
During this time,
We
he
have-
like write some stuff out. Wait, while I'm
I
here,
think we have to
Saul,
consider.
I got some
Yeah.
good stuff for you that's gonna happen.
There may have been somebody writing under his name. I mean, the same thing's true with Deuteronomy, where Moses dies before it's over. Go,
Book of
Katie.
Samuel itself doesn't prescribe Samuel as the author. That's
No,
something
no.
that some tradition has, but most likely the author was, I think Ezra is actually the most likely author because of its connection to Chronicles too. It's a potential author. When we did the thing about different authors and stuff, I didn't list Samuel as the author because you're right. It would be physically impossible for Samuel to write the entirety of Samuel. It's probably very likely that the majority of First Samuel was written by Samuel, and that Ezra and Nehemiah, as they refounded the temple after they came back from Babylon, found all of these writings and used that to create First Samuel and First and Second Kings.
Because if I'm not mistaken, it never says
Yeah.
Samuel's
It
writing
doesn't
this.
say that Samuel wrote it.
It's
Yeah,
not
no,
like
it never does. It
yeah,
never
it's
does.
not like Paul in some of his letters says, "See with what big letters I sign my name at the bottom."
That's why I said I don't know why they're referring Christian that persists this tradition that it's like, oh yeah, Samuel wrote the whole scroll. And
Yeah.
You know, there's logic, and then there's
So most of the scholars I read would say that either Ezra or one of the other priests at that time were the authors.
Look, I'm just ingrained in that tradition enough to think that if God wanted Samuel to write a whole book about things that happened decades after his life, that he could, but there's nothing that says that he did.
Yeah.
So we don't have to, if it said Samuel wrote this, at the end of 2 Samuel it says, and Samuel wrote all this before he died, I'd believe it, but he doesn't say that.
That's one of the scholars that I really like is a biblical scholar called Dr. Constable. What I like about him is he never hangs his hat on any specific pin, but he always points out like, here's a couple like things that people believe and here's what people see. And that's something that I was studying this week. He was mentioning how some traditions believe this, and this is we also consider. I saw the Ezra authorship possibility, but yeah, they bring those things up, and I was just wondering. It's like, well, we don't have actual. Like even he said there isn't any real claim to that or any kind of physical evidence or even biblical, so they're not really sure. And so I was just wondering if someone knew. But okay, fair enough.
Nothing to add.